The Duke of Larchgate dressed as a stable boy to test her heart. She treated him like a king. I had been, at various points in my life, described as the most feared man in 3 counties, the coldest duke since the last ice age, and by one particularly imaginative dowager at a Mayfair dinner, a gargoyle in a good cravat. None of these descriptions troubled me. What troubled me in the autumn of my 32nd year was something considerably more particular. I could not find a woman who looked at me. Not at me, they looked at the title, at the estate. At the annual income, my man of business had the misfortune of having once mentioned within earshot of a countess, who had apparently committed the figure to memory and distributed it across the whole of polite society within a fortnight. They looked at my tailor, at my horses, at the question of whether Larchgate Hall would want for a proper mistress before I was 40. They looked at all of that with great industry and precision. Not one of them looked at the man underneath. I had tried twice. Once in London, a baron's daughter with a laugh like a bell and eyes that went flat the moment I mentioned I preferred the country to the city, and then filled again immediately when she recalled that the country included Larchgate with its 11,000 acres and its famous north wing. Once in Bath, a widow of 28 who was gentle and genuinely pleasant. Until the evening I appeared for dinner in a coat I had worn for a day's riding and forgot to change. And she looked at me with an expression I recognized as the calculation of whether a man who could not be trusted to dress for dinner could be trusted to dress for a season. After Bath, I sat in my library for 3 days reading Tacitus and arriving, slowly, at a conclusion. The test was the problem. Not that I was testing them, every man does. But I was testing them as a duke, which meant I was testing them under conditions that made the test meaningless. Of course, a woman would be gracious to a duke. Of course, she would manage her expressions and moderate her voice and find everything he said interesting. That was not a flaw in the women, it was a flaw in the conditions. I was asking the question with all the answers already on the table. What I needed, I decided, was different conditions. It was my valet Pemberton who mentioned Aldenmore, without intending to be useful. He was reading from a letter about a proposed visit, various houses in the northern counties that might be appropriate for a formal call, and he said, in passing, that the Aldenmore estate had come down somewhat since old Aldenmore's illness, that the daughter was running it, and that she'd been managing it with considerable competence for 2 years without any apparent intention of selling or marrying her way out of the difficulty. He moved on to the next name on the list. I stopped him. The daughter, I said, what is her situation? Pemberton consulted the letter. Miss Cecily Aldenmore, 24, no London season in 2 years. She has declined 3 invitations to house parties. He looked up. She is considered, in the relevant circles, to have rather buried herself. Is she considered anything else? He thought about it. Capable, he said, in the tone of a man who considers this mildly surprising. Her tenants have not left. Her land steward has been with the family 30 years and stayed when he could have found employment elsewhere. The household accounts are, according to the solicitor who manages the estate trust, unexpectedly sound. I was already thinking. Write to Garvith, I said. Garvith was my head groom at Larchgate, an honest man of 50 who had worked for my father and had absolutely no interest in my social consequence. Tell him I need the name of a reputable seasonal hand, the kind that travels between estates. Someone who might plausibly turn up at Aldenmore looking for work. Pemberton looked at me for a long moment. The name will cross, I said. I'll need appropriate clothing. He looked at me for another moment. Yes, Your Grace, he said, and did not ask a single question, which was why I had kept him for 11 years. I arrived at Aldenmore on a Tuesday, on foot, with a canvas bag and an old leather vest that Pemberton had found somewhere. I did not ask where. That had the correct quality of having been worn through several seasons. The house was a good-sized manor of pale stone, clearly old, with a garden that had the look of a place being managed rather than enjoyed. Someone had made practical decisions about what to keep and what to let go. The roses were cut back. The kitchen garden was extensive and evidently productive. The south stable, where I presented myself to Garvith's equivalent, a stout, unhurried man named Henlow, was clean, well-organized, and busy. We'll cross, I said, looking for seasonal work. Henlow looked at me the way all good head grooms look at unfamiliar men, thoroughly, without warmth, starting at the hands. Can you muck a stall without being told twice? Yes, sir. Can you hold your tongue when the family's about? Yes, sir. And you've worked with horses before, not just ridden them. Since I was 8, I said, which was true. He grunted. 3 shillings a week and meals at the kitchen table. You bunk in the south loft, you're up before the family. Any trouble with that? None. He nodded once, the way men nod when they've made a decision and see no reason to discuss it further, and that was that. I slept in the loft above the south stable on a straw pallet with a wool blanket. I made my own bed the first morning badly and felt more like myself than I had in 6 months. She came on the second morning. It was before sunrise. I had been up for an hour, had fed the horses on the east side of the stable block, and was beginning on the stalls when I heard the yard door and looked up to see a young woman in muddy half-boots and a riding coat that had been good, perhaps 3 seasons ago, carrying a bucket of oats that she absolutely did not need to carry herself. I had looked at portraits of women all my life and formed opinions about them from a comfortable distance. This was different. Cecily Aldenmore in her own yard before the sun was up was not a portrait of anything. She was simply a person who was somewhere she was needed, doing something that needed doing, without any apparent interest in whether anyone noticed. She set the bucket down and began measuring feed into the individual pails with a briskness that told me she had done this 1,000 times, and had calculated exactly how long it took, and intended to stick to that calculation. "You're the new hand," she said, not looking up. "Will Cross, miss. Have you introduced yourself to Henlow?" "Yesterday afternoon, miss. He put me in the south loft." "Good," she moved to the next stall. "Do you know these horses?" "I'm learning them." She glanced at me for the first time. I had prepared myself in some vague way for an assessment, the kind of look a woman of her station gives a man she employs, partly judgment, partly the cataloging of whether he'll do. This was not that look. She looked at me the way a good carpenter looks at a joint that might need tightening, not unkindly, simply practically, wanting to know if the thing would hold. "The gray in the third stall," she said, "has been favoring his left foreleg. Henlow thinks it's minor. I'm not satisfied with that. Will you check it this morning and tell me what you find?" "Of course, miss." She finished with the oats, lifted the empty bucket, and walked out without ceremony. I stood in the stable for a moment after she'd gone, aware of something I couldn't immediately name. Then I went to check the gray's leg. I had not examined a horse's leg in several years, but I had spent a great deal of time in stables as a boy, before the title became fully my problem, before there were always men to do the things I might once have done myself, and I remembered enough. The gray had a stone bruise, small and recent, the kind of thing that would resolve with rest and careful management, but that would worsen if ignored. I wrapped the leg with the bandaging I found hanging near Henlow's supply room, noted that the horse should be kept off hard ground for at least 2 days, and went to find Miss Aldenmore. She was in the yard speaking to her land steward, a careful, elderly man I later learned was named Drury, who had the manner of someone who had been loyal to this family through considerable difficulty and intended to go on being loyal regardless of the difficulty increasing. When she saw me, she excused herself and came over. I told her what I'd found. She listened with the kind of attention that is rarer than most people think, not waiting for a pause in which to speak, not nodding in the performed way that signals a person is constructing their response rather than hearing yours, but actually listening, following what I said, noting the specific details. When I finished, she said, "You're right, and Henlow is wrong, which he won't thank you for telling him, so don't. Just manage the gray and I'll address Henlow separately." She paused. "Thank you, Will, that was exactly right." She walked back to Drury. I stood in the yard in the early morning light and felt, for reasons I could not immediately rationalize, as though I had done something that mattered. It was a feeling I was not accustomed to in connection with horses. 5 mornings in a row. She came every morning before sunrise. She never came when the work was already done. She arrived when there was still work to do, and she did her portion of it without announcement: the feed distribution, the checking of water levels, the brief examination of any horse she was concerned about. She did not linger after the work was finished. She moved on to whatever came next. I began to understand the rhythm of her days. The early stable visit, then an hour in the house with the accounts, then the walk of the fields with Drury, Then whatever afternoon brought suppliers, correspondence, the management of a household that was operating on a carefully reduced budget without any reduction in the dignity with which it operated. The kitchen meals I ate with the hands were plain and very good. The cook, Mrs. Barfoot, had been with the family since before Cecily was born, and fed the staff with the same serious attention she evidently brought to everything. Cecily came through the kitchen twice that first week. Once with an extra loaf of bread she said Mrs. Barfoot had made too much of. Once with a pot of good coffee that I later learned she purchased from her own household accounts, and contributed to the staff's table each week without making anything of it. These were not gestures. They were not performances of benevolence. They were maintenance. The regular, quiet, practical maintenance of people who were doing work that mattered and deserved to be treated accordingly. She was not warming herself on the gratitude of her staff. She was simply keeping the arrangement sound. On the third morning, she caught me. I was carrying feed across the yard, and I caught the grain room latch with my shoulder in the automatic way of a man who has been solving small logistical problems in large households his whole life. A faint, unconscious competence that belonged to someone who had grown up in this kind of environment, not to a seasonal hand who had been at Aldenmore for 3 days. I heard her come to a stop behind me. "You've been in a lot of stables," she said. It was not an accusation. It was not suspicious. It was an observation of the kind she made constantly, a practical noting of a fact she had observed and filed away. "A few," I said. She looked at me for a moment, then she nodded and went on with what she was doing. This, I discovered, was one of the most disquieting things about Cecily Aldenmore. She was acutely observant and entirely uninterested in making you aware that she was acutely observant. She did not press. She did not display her perceptions to demonstrate her intelligence. She simply noticed things, retained them, and decided quietly how much weight to give them. Her decision, in this case, was apparently to take Will Cross at whatever he chose to offer and ask for nothing more. I spent the rest of that morning feeling the lie more acutely than I had at any point since I arrived. On the 4th day, her cousin arrived. His name was Desmond Aldenmore, and he came in a good carriage with 2 horses that were better than anything currently in the Aldenmore stables, which I did not think he was aware was an observation available to anyone who looked. He was a pleasant-looking man of about 30, the kind of pleasant that is the default setting of someone who has never had much occasion to be unpleasant, because they have never had much occasion to want for anything. He was agreeable to Cecily, I could see, in the house. He was something else entirely in the stable. He arrived in the yard that afternoon wanting a horse saddled. He told me so. He did not ask. He did not look at me. He spoke with the flat, executive indifference of someone who has never considered that the person receiving the instruction might be capable of having a thought that was not directly related to executing it. I saddled the horse. He did not say thank you. He rode out without looking back. I stood in the yard for a moment, noting the horse he had taken. It was the bay, an older animal, broad and comfortable, well-mannered and reliable. It was also 17 years old with knees that required some consideration. Cecily appeared in the stable doorway 20 minutes later. She looked at the empty stall. She looked at me. "He took the bay." "Yes, miss." She closed her eyes briefly, not in distress, but in the contained way of a woman who has known this particular problem for some time and has developed a method for managing it. "He always takes the bay. The bay has bad knees." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the empty stall. Then she said, "When he comes back, offer to rub the horse down for him. He'll accept without paying attention. Substitute the gray's leg is healed enough for light work, and it'll do him good. Don't explain. If Desmond asks which horse you put away, he won't remember which one he rode out on." She paused, then added, as though this required a postscript, "He's not cruel, he simply doesn't notice." She walked back to the house. I stood in the stable and held that sentence. He's not cruel, he simply doesn't notice. She had declined to make her cousin into a villain. She had declined to perform the small theatrical of sighing over his failings, of letting me see her suffer under his carelessness, of turning it into anything at all beyond what it was. A man who did not notice things, managed by a woman who noticed everything, and had organized her management of the situation so smoothly that he would never be aware she was doing it. She was managing her cousin, her horse, her resources, and her patients simultaneously. and she was doing it with such economy of effort that no one in the house would ever see the work. I had come to Aldenmore to find out what a woman was like when she thought no one important was watching. It occurred to me, standing in that stable, that I had made a significant error in my thinking. The assumption had been that people are one thing when they believe themselves unobserved, and another thing when they believe someone of consequence is present. That is what I had expected to discover: the private self, relaxed or careless or self-interested, versus the public performance. Cecily Aldenmore appeared to be exactly the same in both conditions. Which meant there were no conditions. Which meant I had not found a woman performing for an audience of none. I had found a woman who simply was what she was, all the way through, without any layer of management between her private self and her public one. Not because she was careless, but because there was nothing in her that required concealment. The formal letter arrived on the 5th morning. I was in the yard with the horses when Henlo brought it up from the gate, a letter on good paper, heavy with a seal I knew, because it was my own. My man of business had sent it exactly when I had instructed him to, 5 days after my arrival, announcing that the Duke of Larchgate would be paying a formal visit to Aldenmore in 2 days' time, and hoped Miss Aldenmore would find the occasion convenient. I watched from a careful distance as Henlo carried it to the house. I watched the window on the upper floor where Cecily kept the small sitting room she used for estate business. After a few minutes, I saw her cross the window, a brief movement, purposeful, unhurried. Then she came down to the stable. She did not come immediately. She came at her usual time with her usual bucket and did her usual portion of the feed distribution. When she had finished, she came and stood a few feet away and looked at the gray, whose leg had healed cleanly and who was doing well. "A letter came this morning," she said, not looking at me. She said it the way a person mentions the weather, a fact of the day, worth noting, not worth performing. "I heard Henlo mention it," I said, which was not technically a lie. "The Duke of Larchgate intends to visit." She ran a hand down the gray's neck, checking the muscle the way she always checked things, methodically, without pretense. "He is looking apparently at properties in the area. Aldenmore is among them." I said nothing. "He has a reputation," she said, "for being exacting." "I've heard that." She moved to the next stall. "We'll need to have the north paddock properly fenced before Thursday. Can you see to that today?" "Yes, miss." She nodded. She checked the second horse. She checked the third. She found nothing wrong with any of them because there was nothing wrong with any of them because I had been doing my work carefully and she had been correct about everything she'd asked me to attend to. She found the fence board I had replaced 2 days earlier, a loose post in the east fence that I had fixed without being asked, and she stopped. She looked at it. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "It needed doing," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned and looked at me with those direct, practical eyes, and she smiled, not the smile of a woman managing a situation, not the pleasant expression she brought to the yard as a matter of professional conduct, but the small, entirely real smile of a person who has found something unexpectedly right in an ordinary morning. "Thank you, Will," she said, "for the fence and for the gray and for telling Henlo he was wrong in a way that didn't make him feel wrong about it." She paused. "You're very good at being here." She walked back toward the house. I watched her go. Then I took off my cap. "Miss Aldenmore." She stopped. She turned. She looked at me with the quality of attention I had come to recognize, not alarm, not suspicion, simply that clear-eyed practical regard that she brought to everything. "I have a confession to make," I said. She waited, not impatiently. She had the particular patience of someone who has learned that most confessions are more complicated in the making than in the telling, and who is prepared to give the process whatever time it requires. I was aware, standing in the yard of the estate where she had been working since before dawn, in clothes Pemberton had found in some recondite corner of a coaching inn, that I had spent 5 days being treated with perfect consistency by a woman who had no reason to treat a seasonal stable hand with perfect consistency. She had thanked me when I did something well. She had corrected me once, briefly, when I put a tool back in the wrong place, and had then moved on. She had brought good coffee to a table where I ate with men she paid to work on her land, and she had done it without ceremony. I did not know, standing there, how to make the next sentence not be an embarrassment. "My name is not Will Cross," I said. Or it is, partially, in the sense that my given name is William and Cross is a family name on my mother's side. But you'll know me in 2 days as something rather longer. She looked at me. Cavendish, I said. Larchgate, the formal version has several additional components. She was very still. Then slowly she looked at the fence board I had replaced. She looked at the stable yard. She looked at the south loft window where she had, presumably, known someone was sleeping since Tuesday. She looked at the Gray's stall. Was the Gray's leg actually troubling him, she said carefully, or was that a test? The leg was real, I said. I want you to know that specifically. I would not have invented a horse's injury. She considered this with the gravity it deserved. You came, she said, as a stable hand. To what? See what we were like. To see what you were like, I said, when you thought no one important was watching. She was quiet for a moment. And what did you find? She said, not archly, not with the particular feminine performance of a woman who knows the answer and is waiting for you to say it. Simply, genuinely, as a person asking a question. I found, I said, that you are exactly the same in both conditions, which is either a very ordinary thing or a very extraordinary thing, and I have been here 5 days, and I am increasingly certain it is the latter. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she did something I had not anticipated. Her composure, which had held perfectly through the whole conversation, gave way, not into tears, not into cold anger, not into the performance of wounded dignity. It gave way into laughter. Not the broad, social laughter of a ballroom. A small, entirely helpless sound, quickly suppressed, of a person who has been presented with something too genuinely absurd to manage with complete decorum. You slept in the loft, she said. Yes. For 5 days. Yes. The straw is dreadful, she said. I keep meaning to replace it. She pressed her hand briefly to her mouth, still fighting the laughter. I am trying, she said with precision, to be appropriately. I don't know what the appropriate response to this is. Anger would be legitimate, I said. I'm not angry, she said. I think I should be. I'm working on it. She looked at me, really looked at me, in the way she looked at everything, straight on, without performance, seeing what was actually there. Was any of it, did you mean any of it? Every word, I said. The Gray's leg, the fence board. The coffee is excellent and Mrs. Barfoot is a genius. And you run this estate, I said. The way a general runs a campaign with complete economy of resource and zero tolerance for waste and a very clear idea of what matters and what doesn't, which is rarer than it should be. She was quiet. That is, I said, intended as the highest possible compliment. I know it is, she said. Which is the thing? She looked at me still straight, still that practical regard, but something underneath it that hadn't been there before or that I hadn't been paying adequate attention to. I've had compliments about my management. People are gracious about it. They say it's admirable and then they mean it's rather sad that a woman my age should have to be managing anything. You don't mean it that way. No, I said, I don't. You mean it, she said, the way you'd mean it about a general, the way Drury means it, which is why I trust Drury. She looked at the yard, her yard, which she ran with that exact precision, that exact clear-eyed understanding of what it needed. What will your name be, then, when you come as a proper guest? Cavendish, I said, Larchgate. The full version involves his grace and a good deal of bowing, which I find exhausting. She looked at the fence board again. I'm going to continue calling you Will, she said, until I can look at you without wanting to laugh, which may take some time. Is that acceptable? Entirely, I said. I should tell you, in case it affects your calculation, that I came here intending to decide whether Aldenmore was a property worth pursuing, and I have decided. I stopped. She waited with that patient, entirely unperformed attention. Not as a property, I said. I have no interest in Aldenmore as a property. I stopped again. I have a great deal of interest in you having the resources to run it as you see fit, for as long as you wish to, with the fence boards replaced, and the Gray properly rested, and whatever else the place needs. Whether that is any of my business is a separate question, and I recognize that I have done a great deal today to make it difficult to answer that question fairly, and I am sorry for that. She looked at me for a long moment. The sun was fully up now. The yard was warm. Somewhere in the east field, one of Drury's men was calling something to another, and the sound carried clearly in the morning air, and a sparrow on the paddock fence considered us both with the brief, incurious attention of a creature that had somewhere else to be. "I'm going to go," said Cecily Aldenmore, "and speak to Mrs. Barfoot about Thursday's menu, because whether you are Will Cross or the Duke of Larchgate, you will apparently be a guest of this house in 2 days, and I will need to plan accordingly." She paused. "And when you arrive on Thursday in the carriage and with the correct title and however many footmen you consider appropriate, I will receive you with all the formality that your position requires." She paused again. "And I will probably be thinking about the straw in the south loft the entire time." She turned to go. "Miss Aldenmore," I said. She stopped. "The straw," I said, "genuinely dreadful. Something should be done about it." The laugh escaped before she caught it. Small, real, unguarded, aimed at nothing in particular. The laugh of a person who is alone with something that has delighted them and has briefly forgotten to manage it. She walked back to the house without looking back. I stood in the yard for a long time after she had gone. I had come to Aldenmore to run a test. I had designed the test carefully, the clothes, the name, the role. I had been scientific about it, methodical, confident in the premise. The premise had been that a woman who did not know who I was would show me who she was. What I had not accounted for was the corollary, that a woman who did not know who I was would also show me who I was by being consistently herself, so that I had no surface to perform against, no expectation to manage, no calculation to navigate, and had simply become, for 5 days, a man who checked a horse's leg and replaced a fence board because both things needed doing. I had not been that man in years. I had forgotten what he felt like. She had not done that to me deliberately. She had done it by accident, simply by being wholly what she was, direct, practical, consistent, capable, possessed of a laugh she could not always contain, and a habit of noticing everything without displaying the noticing, and the rare quality of saying thank you as a fact rather than a performance. I had gone looking for someone who could see past what I was. I had found, instead, someone who made it unnecessary to be anything other than what I was. On Thursday, I arrived in the carriage, with the footmen and the correct title and the formal letter of introduction that my secretary had prepared, and that I considered, on reflection, to be somewhat excessive. Drury met me at the gate. Henlow took the horses. Mrs. Barfoot had prepared a meal that demonstrated a complete mastery of what guests of consequence expected, and a cheerful disregard for whether that was what they were going to get. Cecily Aldenmore received me in the drawing-room with all the correct formality. She curtsied. She said, "Your Grace," with perfect composure. Then she looked at me. The laugh was there, behind her eyes, private, genuine, entirely for herself. The laughter of a woman who knew something no one else in the room knew. I sat down across from her at the table her family had used for generations, in the house she had been keeping sound by the force of her own considerable will, and I thought, she is laughing at me quietly, and I do not mind even slightly, and I cannot remember the last time I did not mind anything. We spoke for 2 hours. We spoke about the estate and the land and the north field, and whether the gray was going to be fit for light work by spring. We spoke about Drury, who Cecily said was the most valuable person on the property, and who I said deserved to know it more explicitly, and she said he knew it very well and did not need it spelled out for him. We spoke about her father, briefly, with the precision of a woman who has found the words that let her discuss a painful subject without being consumed by it. We did not speak about any of it directly, not about the loft or the canvas breeches or the 5 mornings before sunrise. We had, by some unspoken agreement, decided to file those days in a separate location and address them only when both of us were ready. Before I left, I stood in the hall while Drury brought my coat, and Cecily stood near the drawing-room door, and she looked at me with those direct, entirely unperformed eyes. "You'll come again," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," I said. "On Thursday fortnight. I'll have the accounts in better order by then, and you can look at them if you like." "I would like," I said, "very much." She nodded. She looked at me for one more moment. "Will," she said. I stopped. "The straw in the south loft," she said. "I've asked Henlow to see to it, in case you find yourself in the neighborhood again unexpectedly." She went back into the drawing-room. I put on my coat and walked out into the November afternoon, into a yard I had mucked and fed and quietly reorganized over 5 mornings, under a sky the color of old pewter. And I thought of a woman in muddy boots who had carried her own bucket of oats because the work needed doing, and who had said thank you because I had done something right, and who had laughed, really laughed, without management or performance, at the absurdity of a duke in a loft. I thought, this is what I was looking for. Not someone who could see past the title. Someone who made the title irrelevant, not by ignoring it, but by being so completely, so consistently, so entirely herself that the thing you were underneath the title was the only thing that had any traction with her at all. I had arrived at Aldenmore with a plan and a set of borrowed clothes and a theory about human nature. I left on a Thursday afternoon with no plan at all, and the very clear sense that I did not need one. She knew where I was. She had always known where I was. She had known, in fact, since approximately the third morning, when I caught the grain room latch with my shoulder in a way that didn't belong to a seasonal hand. She had simply decided to let me finish the test,